Hello and welcome to the Album Man. This is my guide to the Rolling Stones. We're going to be going chronologically through every Stones album, from the self-titled debut all the way through to 2016's Blue and Lonesome. Though before we begin, I should note that for the early 60s albums, I'm going to be mainly focusing on the UK releases, because up until around Between the Buttons, the US and the UK actually had quite different releases for a lot of Stones records. They often had the same names, confusingly enough, and there were quite different track lists. But there are some instances in which I actually prefer the US releases, so we'll get to that when the time comes.
I tried to tell you, but you didn't want to know.
The Rolling Stones' 1964 came only 2 years after the band was formed, consisting of the classic 60s lineup of...
This is the lead vocal right here, Mr. Mick Jagger. Hi, Mick. How are you? And this would be Brian Jones. Is that right? Brian Jones, how are you? And you are?
Bill Wyman.
Bill Wyman. He plays bass guitar. And your name?
I'm Keith Richard.
Keith, how are you? Keith Richard. And your name?
Charlie.
What is it?
Watts.
Charlie what?
Watts.
Charlie Watts.
Most of the songs on this album really are just like old 50s R&B covers, like Route 66 by Bobby Troup, and I Just Want to Make Love to You by Willie Dixon, or Carol by Chuck Berry, and they're some of the more, I guess, memorable covers on the album. And these songs really go to showcase the talent which Richards and Jagger had, as well as just their chemistry within the context of the band. They give these American R&B songs a real British flair and edge, while still staying pretty true to the blues and R&B roots. There's only a few original compositions on the album. Now I've Got a Witness, Little by Little, and Tell Me You're Coming Back, and the first two, oddly enough, are credited to Nanka Fledge, which, if you're not aware, is the pseudonym which the band would use for group compositions around that time. Now I've Got a Witness, though, it's kind of like a dull instrumental, and Little by Little, on the other hand, actually has a killer harmonica part with this distinct classic 50s blues influence, and it just feels so fresh and quintessentially British, with like a rough and untamed edge to it. Tell Me, on the other hand, is a bit more of an anomaly within the album. It differs to the usual kind of blues, R&B stuff of most early Stones, and is instead closer to the contemporary pop of the Beatles at the time. It's a slow, acoustic ballad, but it does show a really promising knack for songwriting, and this kind of more pop-oriented sound would become far more prevalent in the Stones' compositions in later albums. Overall, it's a promising start to their career, but its focus on covers does kind of bog it down a bit. There aren't that many killer songs on it. There is quite a bit of filler, and the production is pretty fuzzy and cheap sounding, even by the standards of the early 60s. I would say that it is certainly worth a listen. I mean, it is an album that I enjoy and can listen to end for a bit of fun, but it's not quite where I'd recommend starting with the band. I'd give this around 3 stars.
Most successful entertainers have always been the most egotistical ones on stage. They might not be as egotistical as that off stage, but all that ego is got rid of on stage.
What sort of person do you think you are off the stage?
About half as egotistical.
Everybody wants somebody. Everybody needs somebody to love.
The Rolling Stones' number 2, 1965. The problem with this record is that it just kind of is an inferior continuation of the first album, with very little musical or stylistic development. Similarly to the first album, it's primarily a record of covers, with 3 originals of varying quality. The first side is the stronger one and has a stunning cover of the Solomon Burke soul song Everybody Needs Somebody to Love, which just improves on the original in every respect. It really does demonstrate the brilliance of the Stones in just this fresh, bluesy and unrefined manner. It's so catchy, and Jagger just gives such a commanding performance. Well, another good song on the first side is the Jagger Richards penned What a Shame, which has a driving bass line and some tight Keith licks thrown in for good measure. It's just kind of like a middle-of-the-road bluesy song, but it's got a good hook to it. The second side is full of more lackluster songs, I guess. You got the Soul cover, Under the Boardwalk, or Off the Hook, which is a short original song, but it is really, really repetitive. Like, it's super short, but it does feel like it kind of drags on forever, I find. This album just, to me, feels limp and flaccid in comparison to the vitality of the original. I mean, it's similar enough that if you like the original, you can't help but also enjoy it. It's not a bad record to put on. I just don't think it's anything special. It really doesn't progress their sound in any way, really. I give this 2.5 stars.
Oh, this is a problem. You've got all this laundry and the...
Laundry takes at least a day to do, and you're 1,000 miles away the next day. That's the trouble.
Who does the laundry?
Some old woman downstairs.
No, I was just wondering, maybe somebody was the monitor for that week or something.
Out of Our Heads, 1965. Now, while I did say that I would really only focus on the UK releases, I also forewarns that there will be some exceptions. Out of Our Heads is a big one when it comes to that. Both the UK and US releases of this album share exactly the same name, but I do think they were pretty vastly different qualities, and that's because the US version includes the brilliant standalone singles which the Stones released around this time, whereas the UK omits them in favour of some weaker covers and originals. There are some exceptions. There's the UK exclusive track Mercy Mercy, which is one of my favourites across the, I guess, 2 versions of the record, showcases Keith Richards' brand new distortion pedal, which he most famously used in Can't Get No Satisfaction, which he picked up kind of around this time. Has some great, strong, memorable lead lines to it. It's such a brilliant guitar song. But of the songs that make the UK one different, I guess, to the US one, that really is kind of the exception to the rule. Generally, both have a similar emphasis of soul over the bluesy R&B of previous records, and I'm just not so convinced that the Stones can do soul half as well as they can blues. Take Hitchhike and Good Time, for example, which are on both versions of the album, so I guess it doesn't really matter. But they rest far more, I feel, on the songwriting of the originals than the actual performances from the band on the record. They're there to kind of highlight Jagger's voice at the expense of fairly standard musicianship. It just feels like the rest of the Stones are going through the motions with these tracks. It doesn't feel it has that magic or that lightning in a bottle that some of their great blues songs have. A good example of this is the original tune, Gotta Get Away, which is on the UK version. This is a soul-inspired song, and doesn't really do that much for me, and I just feel that it's songs like that which are really at to the detriment of this album, especially when compared to the US version, which replaces Gotta Get Away with songs like, I Can Get No Satisfaction, the deeply bluesy Spider and the Fly, or even the kind of harpsichord-driven, proto-psych-inspired, super catchy Play With Fire. These songs, these great pop and blues songs, just have a previously unheard depth and maturity to the songwriting from this band. And it just makes the US version a far more compelling listen, to be quite honest, with these familiar and classic songs. You do have a really strange inclusion on the US version, which is the song I'm Alright from the Got Live If You Want It EP, which does feel a little bit strange on a studio album because it's really just live and it comes out of nowhere, but I do still find it to be the superior one. If I was going to rate both of them, I'd probably give the US one like a 3.5 stars and the UK one 2.5 stars. They are good albums worth listening to, but the US one is probably what I'd recommend.
Well, I don't like to tell you about my musical education because the others all laugh at me, so pass on to Keith.
My sweet Lady Jane, when I see you again.
Aftermath, 1966. This is the first Stones album to consist entirely of original compositions from the classic Jagger-Richards partnership. as well as marking a real stylistic turn for the band. Here we see Brian Jones, I feel, really come to the forefront with his experimentation. He just starts to go wild with the instruments, and well, it only gets wilder from here. Here he starts with sitar or dulcimer, adding a kind of a light Indian flair to a few of their songs, such as Mother's Little Helper or Lady Jane. And this is similar to what the Beatles, of course, were doing around that time on albums like Revolver. Consequently, the arrangements and melodies here just have far more depth and complexity than the early records, which are relying more on simplistic blues melodies. Here we have them incorporating more complex pop structures into the Jagger-Richards partnership, but also managing to incorporate really disparate experimental influences from all of the Indian noodling that Brian Jones is doing as well, but still kind of keeping a core blues, Stonesy sound. And while it could be argued that some of the Indian influence is at times a little on the, I guess, heavy-handed side, sometimes it feels like an afterthought. It doesn't feel always like the track was built entirely around it. It does add some lovely touches to some of the songs. Take the acoustic ballad Lady Jane, which is a beautifully sung song, which is elevated so much by the harpsichord and dulcimer present, which just create a haunting backdrop for Jagger's voice. Another is I Am Waiting, which I guess has more of like an Indian melody as the core focus to it, but it's beautifully arranged with maracas and acoustic guitar around this core Indian-inspired melody. Despite this influence, it's not like they quite went full George Harrison, and there still are moments of this record which are just straight up blues numbers. Don't You Bother Me, or Flight 505, it's weirdly inserted like distorted bass, and then you got the 11-minute Going Home. Going Home is actually notable for being one of the very first songs on a studio album to go over 10 minutes. And it does feel like a bit of a leap. We've got all these like 3-4 minute songs, sometimes even less, and then suddenly you're here with an 11-minute jam. But I just think it's a great homage to the blues with a killer harmonica part building towards, in a kind of a hypnotic way, towards its mighty conclusion. It's one of those songs that I feel you can just sit back, listen to on some great hi-fi, and just let wash over you. It shows the Stones, I guess, at the pinnacle of their live powers, because it's an extended bluesy jam. It's like the kind of stuff that they would do live. And while there are live albums, or certainly a live EP from around this time, and nowadays there's all sorts of archival stuff, there's something about this being recorded in the studio with that great sound quality, which just shows the Stones at the height of their powers. And at 53 minutes, it does seem a little long for this era, and there is filler, there's high and dry, it's not easy, and what to do, they really don't seem to do too much, and it can at times feel like a bit of a juggling act, this record. It's trying to balance the blues and R&B, it's trying to balance the pop and kind of stuff from Beach Boys and Beatles and those aesthetics with then this Indian influence. But even so, it's not enough to detract from what is a wonderful slice of the mid-60s. 3.5 stars.
You know I'm smiling, baby. Smiling, baby. I'm just smiling, baby, now. And you know that ever.
Between the Buttons, 1967, Jagger may have described this album as basically more or less rubbish, but I think it's far from it. I actually think this is one of the Stones' most overlooked gems. It showcases an eclectic mix of psychedelic experimentation with cool, calm and collected, but also balances that with a more traditionally Stonesy, hearty, blues rock sound, something like Miss Amanda Jones. There's really two ingredients that I think make this album such an interesting, diverse and wonderful listen. The first of those is the use of piano and organ with a hell of a lot of pianists. You thought, oh yeah, well, Ian Stewart, he's the Stones pianist. Not on this record, there are a lot of them. We got Jack Nietzsche, who has a driving performance on most famously Let's Spend the Night Together. You got Nicky Hopkins, who does some like kind of vaudeville style stuff, I guess, on Cool, Calm, Collected. Even Keith Richards participates in the frenzy of piano and organ, providing organ on She Smiles Sweetly. And then finally, you do of course have Ian Stewart doing some of his trademark bluesy piano on Miss Amanda Jones. The second ingredient is the use of pop melodies over blues and R&B melodies. And I said they were starting to approach this with Aftermath, but here they really feel like they're trying to challenge the Beatles' pop dominance of the era. And you know what? They don't really do that bad a job of it, demonstrating their chops more than adequately as pop songwriters. Now, the astute Stones fans among you may have noticed that I referenced Let's Spend the Night Together, which actually only appears on the US version, and this, like Out of Our Heads, is one where I would recommend the US version over the UK one. The UK version differs really only with 2 songs. So the UK version's got Backstreet Girl and Please Go Home. Now, Backstreet Girl is a perfectly pleasant ballad, but there really is not anything to be missed by its lack of an inclusion on the US version, especially on an album which has a lot of slow songs anyway. Something else that's slowing down the pace is not really needed. There's already things like Yesterday's Papers or She Smiled Sweetly. Well, Please Go Home is just misguided, psychedelic trash from the era, let's be honest. It's incohesive, it lacks direction, and it really is not missed when replaced by Let's Spend the Night Together and Ruby Tuesday, 2 fantastic singles. Performances are great across the board on this record, but for me it's Watts and Wyman who really stand out, just providing such a tight rhythm section to every song, giving it life and vibrancy. They provide a stable rhythm section for then Brian Jones's weirdness to go all over the place with. A great example of this is Cool, Calm, Collected, which is a killer psych jam and has a genuinely manic finale which just speeds up tremendously towards the end. Oh, I don't like the fact that the chorus is kind of slowed down a bit. The rest of the song is just so fun, with vaudeville piano, driving bass lines, there's kazoo, there's harmonica, there's kind of everything and the kitchen sink. But these things, instead of just being there for the sake of it, add new melodies, new crescendos, new dynamic ranges to this song. There are songs, say, on side 2, which I do think is a bit of a lull, like My Obsession or Who's Been Sleeping Here, which typify the kind of psychedelic meandering that was not uncommon from bands who tried to experiment in this era into psychedelia. It just, those melodies don't seem that cleverly written, and the psych component just feels a bit less natural, more tacked on. But still, that doesn't detract from just the sheer joy that this record is to listen to. I mean, a great example of that is the really underrated song Connection. If you want to hear the Stones go 60s psych or 60s pop, this is the pinnacle of that era of the Stones, really. I give the US version a 4 stars, the UK version a 3.5 stars. They are fairly similar, but having Let's Spend the Night Together and Ruby Tuesday does make a difference of making this a classic, and something I have to recommend.
Keith Richards, who's charged with permitting his house to be used for the smoking of cannabis resin, will himself go into the witness box to give evidence when the court resumes at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. And there goes lunch for Fraser and Yeager in the cells. Prawn cocktail, roast lamb with mint sauce, fresh strawberries and cream, 21 and 6 for Yeager.
Their Satanic Majesties Request 1967. This was an album which was kind of ill-fated from the start. 1967 was a really turbulent year for the Stones. Both Yeager and Richards were both convicted and sentenced of drug offences, and while those charges were later quashed, as a result, the band was rarely entirely present in the studio at the same time, leaving the bulk of the recording until the end of the session. In fact, it was so chaotic that the producer Andrew Oldham just quit. He was so fed up with the whole thing about halfway through, leaving Yeager and Richards to self-produce for the first time. This album is perhaps the most controversial in the Stones' discography. Many just see this as kind of a subpar Sgt. Pepper wannabe, the Rolling Stones following trends and trying to be the Beatles in a mindless psychedelic voyage, and I want to disagree to an extent. While no doubt this was trying to capitalise on the success of the Beatles' foray into psychedelia, this is an album full of originality and creativity, and it was a bold step for the Stones to take, and I think it's one which in many ways does pay off, though there's also many ways where it doesn't. I mean, it does contain the worst song in the Stones' career, Sing This All Together, See What Happens. This is just like a drug-fueled meander and just has no musically redeeming features, to be honest. It's something which really should never have seen the light of day, should never have been allowed off the cutting room floor. But on the other hand, it does also have one of the best songs from the period. She's a Rainbow is a bright, vibrant piece of gorgeous string arrangement from future Led Zeppelin bassist John Paul Jones, which rivals even George Martin of the Beatles fame in terms of string arrangements, and this gorgeous melody accompanies it on piano from Nicky Hopkins. It's got an outrageously catchy chorus, and there are just few bands that did a psychedelic song as good as this, full stop. Or you get something really strange, like the experimental In Another Land, which is actually sung by Bill Wyman, and it has this almost airly Pink Floyd characteristic to it at first, but then it moves into a chorus featuring many of the characteristics which would come to define the later Stones records into their 70s periods, with Mick coming in on vocals and kind of a bluesy rocker taking over from this strange Floydian opening, and well, the verses do kind of wear thin after a while. It's a really fascinating recording. But as you'd expect from a record fraught with so many difficulties from the outset, it does have some inconsistency, and there's many tracks which really fail to hit the mark, especially because the Stones seem to be trying to cram far too much into each song. Brian Jones tries to play every single strange, weird 60s instrument he could possibly get his hands on, and as a result, the mix ends up feeling quite claustrophobic. The core melodies, which are actually fairly well written, are just not given any space to breathe, unlike in Sgt. Pepper, whereas the stranger Indian vibes and experimental psychedelic nature is more of an addition to the core melodies, accentuating and not overshadowing them. Great examples of this are Sing This All Together, which is not to be confused with Sing This All Together, See What Happens. I mean, why you'd name two songs the trite title Sing This All Together, I really don't know. And then you get something like Gompa as well, which has this kind of experimental African rhythm to it, which is kind of cool, but it's mired in the self-indulgence that ends up, unfortunately, characterizing this record. The Stones in this era were just all about excess, let's be real. It was sex, drugs, it was rock and roll, and their Satanic Majesties request really is the culmination of this. It's a bloated, yet there is still some charm to be found here. It's full of excess, and Between the Buttons is certainly the superior Stones psych record, but there is something here. It is worth giving a listen, but only really if you're big into 60s psych rock. So I give this 3.5 stars.
I'd like just to give you this, Mike.
Thank you, John.
The British public.
You're a blues, John. You're a blues, John. You're blues, John.
Beggars Banquet, 1968. Few albums in rock music have an opening track quite as strong as Beggars Banquet, with the legendary Sympathy for the Devil. The song opens the album with samba rhythms played on maracas and congos. It's a percussively driven track with these mesmerizing, hypnotic rhythms, punctuated by brilliantly thought out, sharp, short lead lines from Keith, adding a kick and a bite. But the most memorable part of all, of course, is Jagger's macabre, captivating performance, capturing him at the height of his career and showing him to be one of the great frontmen of the 60s. I'm sure you already knew that, because who doesn't know Sympathy for the Devil? But what about the rest of the album? Well, the rest of the album actually has quite a different sound to this raucous opening number. It's primarily an acoustic album. By my count, there's really only two songs which are primarily electric guitar driven, and that is Street Fighting Man and Stray Cat Blues. This gives the album a distinctive back to roots, back to the blues kind of feel to it, especially as juxtaposed to the psychedelic wanderings of the last couple of albums. The Stones here are embracing their R&B and country influences from the 50s, and while there are a couple of missteps, it really is a gorgeously composed album. But unfortunately you do get songs like Dear Doctor, which seems perfectly fine with some lovely harmonica and some great harmonies from Mick and Keith, until you get to around the 2:20-ish mark, when Mick goes into a terrible high-pitched falsetto, which unfortunately this will not be the last time we see it. This will become a recurring feature for decades and decades. That does not detract from what is a lovely Stones record and a softer, more gentle direction, but still hard-hitting. This is the final album to feature the guitar stylings of Brian Jones, and he plays some beautiful slide guitar parts throughout. No Expectations is a beautiful example of this, a lovely little ballad, while Prodigal Son is a complete homage to the Delta Blues, stripping back the music and really just showcasing Mick's voice and Keith's playing, the band's cohesion, everything just comes together. But for me, apart from the obvious sympathy for the devil, there's two other songs which really stand out here. That's Street Fighting Man and the politically inspired tune Salt of the Earth. Street Fighting Man is almost like a call to revolution. It's so raucous and rowdy. It captures the political unrest of the era, particularly in Paris's left bank at the time. Whereas Salt of the Earth is just a working class anthem, like Working Class Hero by John Lennon, in that kind of vein. This is a classic album. I can't give it anything less than 4 stars.
Splitting, you know, if those cats can't, if you people, we're splitting, man, if those cats don't stop beating everybody up inside. I want them out of the way, man.
Let It Bleed, 1969. If you thought that 1967 was a turbulent year for the Stones, 1969 eclipsed it by far. In June 1969, Brian Jones was asked to leave the band due to his increasing drug dependency and mental instability, musical unreliability, but less than 1 month later, Brian was found dead, having drowned in his own swimming pool whilst on drugs. And he was replaced by Mick Taylor, who would certainly come to define this era of the Stones, the late 60s, early 70s era. And though he only actually appears on 2 songs on this one, Country Honk on slide guitar and Live With Me on electric, his impact certainly would be felt in later records. Brian does appear on a couple of songs on this album. He appears on Midnight Rambler on the congas, and You Got the Silver on auto harp. As well, in 1969, it was only a few days after Brian's death in which they performed their famous Free Hyde Park gig, their first return to live concerts in 2 years. But then 1969 also saw the Altamont free concert in San Francisco, which is famous for its brutality, loss of life, and as a symbolic end for the 60s dream. Well, Beggars Banquet began the golden era of the Stones from the tail end of the 60s going into the 70s. It was Let It Bleed which really took it to another level. There are a few records which cement their status in rock music just from the opener alone. Give Me Shelter captures the darkness of that era for the Stones and is, in my humble opinion, the best thing the Stones ever did. Yeager described it once as the apocalypse, and I think this song lives up to that reputation. It's a terrifying, violent, and captivating journey, and for once it's not Keith or Mick who stand out performance-wise, not even Charlie or Bill. It's Mary Clayton, the gospel vocalist whose vocals give this song that edge. She recorded her vocals in one evening towards the end of the mixing of the record, and you can hear her voice crack under the strain she's putting it through as she screams into the crescendo, rape, murder, it's just a shot away. But then the other songs on this album are every bit as essential as that one. They managed to seamlessly blend blues and country on this record. You got stuff like the cover of Robert Johnson's Love in Vain, a beautiful, subtle piece, or the Keith sung original You Got the Silver, a song which is really easy to forget about on an album just overshadowed by classics, but holds its own beautifully, and Brian's auto harp contribution and one of his last contributions to the band had such a gorgeous light touch and delicacy to the song, with Keith's voice also holding its own. But there really are three centerpieces to the sound, one of which we've discussed, Gimme Shelter. The other two are Midnight Rambler and You Can't Always Get What You Want. Midnight Rambler, personal favourite of mine, in some ways feels like a continuation from Aftermath's Going Home, especially the live versions such as on Get Your Ya-Ya's Out. Keith described this as a song which only the Stones could make, and it's hard to disagree. It's a loose, bluesy jam at the centre of the album, but while Going Home is a more straight-up, long-form blues number, this has a dark, mysterious feel to it. Well, the other masterpiece, You Can't Always Get What You Want, is a groove-oriented song, a bit more like Sympathy for the Devil. I mean, you try and think of what the core riff of Sympathy for the Devil is, and instead you're just going to think of that iconic percussive part. Here we have African rhythms and gospel music, bluesy infusions, the iconic descending piano line, and some of Keith's tastiest lead licks topping it off with that slightly Dylan-esque performance from Yeager. It's just a terrific end to a terrific album. It's 5 stars. It is an essential rock album for anyone.
And everybody keeps asking, how does it feel to succeed Brian Jones?
It's very difficult for him to answer. How can he answer it?
Yeah.
I tell you, he hasn't succeeded Brian Jones, but I tell you who has Bobby Keys. Bobby Keys is a reincarnation of Brian Jones.
Sticky Fingers, 1971. I didn't really have anything to criticise about Let It Bleed, to be honest. But thinking about it, I do think I have one criticism. It's not Sticky Fingers. If you go away and only listen to one Stones album because of this video, this is the one you have to hear. This is the one where the dynamic between Mick Taylor and Keith Richards, which was only hinted at with songs like Live With Me on Let It Bleed, really comes into its own with a dynamic, exciting, fresh Stones record. Just the finesse and tightness to the blues rock sound of this album. Your Brown Sugar with that oh so unforgettable saxophone, or Can You Hear Me Knocking, the 7-minute epic with 2 minutes of Mick Taylor soloing at the end, punctuated by stabs of saxophone. This album is a blues rock masterclass. It's rhythmic, it's melodic, it's full of so much feeling. There are just a few albums in rock music which have as many iconic riffs as this does. I mean, Brown Sugar is a essential guitar beginner's song, or Bitch's punchy riff which you will not stop humming for days. But while many see this album's achievement as mainly as a blues rock album, for me what makes this album stand out is the ballads. The Stones here really seem to have just mastered the art of writing a great ballad. There's so many people who say that Wild Horses is their favourite Stones song, and I can certainly see why, but that's also accompanied by ballads such as Sister Morphine and Moonlight Mile. Wild Horses, the country-tinged, beautiful song, is just one that you wouldn't have thought that the shabby blues rockers, the bad boys of rock in the 60s would be capable of. It's just so sincere. I'm not sure there's any other Stones song in their catalogue which feels as honest or as real as this one. You really feel like you're hearing Yeager wear his heart on his sleeve. But then you also have Moonlight Mile, a Mick and Taylor composition with Keith nowhere to be found. And Mick uses these ballads to capture what it's like to be on the road. Wild Horses is about being on the road and just wanting to be anywhere else, as far away as possible from it. But Moonlight Mile takes a more positive view to that. It's the feeling of being on the road. My dreams are fading down the railway line. I'm just another moonlit mile down the right. It's lyrically one of Yeager's best, but yet what really elevates it is the string contributions from Paul Buckmaster in the last couple of minutes of Moonlight Mile, adding a new lease of life just when you think this song is about to end. Yeager had stripped away his dangerous rock and roll persona on this album and just opened up. The combination of blues rock and personal ballads make this for me a perfect album. I couldn't say anything negative about Sticky Fingers. 5 stars.
If I were Mick Jagger, what would you want to know from me?
How much do you weigh?
What do I weigh? Why do you want to know that?
I don't know. I always like to know how much people weigh.
Exile on Main Street, 1972. This is the Stones' most ambitious record for sure, an 18-track double vinyl record, which many see now as the Stones' magnum opus, but actually received quite a negative reception when it came out back in 1972. Still, its re-evaluation has kind of cemented it as a classic. The Stones here started to slip deeper into drug addiction. I mean, you may not have thought that was possible, but the Stones always seem to be finding new ways of slipping deeper and deeper into drug addiction, but this album kind of signals a last hurrah for the Stones, back to basic, bluesy, rootsy sound. At this point, Jagger was already starting to express his boredom with rock music. He wanted to try other things. He felt that the Stones were just treading water. They weren't doing anything new, and I'm not sure that's a fair criticism to level against Exile on Main Street. It certainly doesn't reinvent the wheel, but it is a glorious collection of songs and showcases the peak of the Richards-Taylor partnership, and certainly does push the Stones' boundaries. And it is that partnership which is at the core of this record. Even though the guitars are hard-panned right and left, the riffs manage to weave in and out of each other, combining with Watts and Wyman to create a rhythmic tightness in tunes such as Rocks Off, or my personal favourite, Tumbling Dice, a classic Stones tune with a gospel inflection. And this really is a varied album. I mean, you've got everything and the kitchen sink here. You got R&B, country, gospel, soul, rock and roll, blues. Every genre which has permeated their repertoire so far is here in full force, and I can certainly see why people see this as the culmination of the Stones sound. Sweet Virginia is as good a ballad as any they'd make, and Rip This Joint is as raucous and dangerous as they'd ever get, and Happy is as radio-friendly, as catchy as anything they'd make. I mean, the sheer breadth and diversity of instruments across this album. You've got tenor sax, double bass, gospel backing vocals, trumpets, and just volumes of material. It is an album which keeps on giving with every listen, slowly unveiling itself more and more to you. But despite all that, it's not perfect, and it is not the Stones' most consistent album. I mean, it is 18 tracks long. A double album is a huge feat for any artist, and I feel at 67 minutes, it does start to drag, especially around side 3. You've got terrible stuff like I Just Want to See His Face, or the really boring Ted on the Run, and it does pick up. The songs like Shine a Light, Soul Survivor on side 4. It's just inconsistent. I mean, it's inherent with many double albums. It's not saying you can blame the Stones too much for it. It's a terrific amount of music that they've put out here, and I wouldn't recommend it as an entry point for those reasons. You're definitely better off picking up Sticky Fingers or Let It Bleed to start your Stones journey. But saying that, you still really can't go too wrong with Exile on Main Street. Put it on a bright, sunny day, let it wash over you, and it's a hell of a listen. 4.5 stars.
And as for yourself personally, do you find that the Stones give all the musical outlets you'd like to have for them?
Oh, no. No, there's lots of other things I'd like to do with other people. And I will do when I get the opportunity.
Lord, I'm dancing, dancing, dancing so brave. Dancing, dancing, dancing so brave. Dancing loud, keep your hand on me.
Goat's Head Soup, 1973. This album is often seen to harken the end of the Stones' golden era, that era that began with Beggars Banquet, where they redefined blues rock. They pushed, giving everything they could, and here they kind of start to stray away from the formula which had served them so well. Here they start to incorporate soul and funk elements. Now, one thing I will say, if you're not that big into soul and funk, is that sometimes the presence of these elements can be a little bit overstated by critics. I mean, they are there in songs like Dancing with Mr. D or Can You Hear the Music or Do 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 Heartbreakers, but there are still quite a few songs on this album which follow more traditionally the template set out in Sticky Fingers or Exile for a Stonesy tune with Mick Taylor. What characterises this album is its slower pace, much like Beggars Banquet. But instead of the acoustic guitar you find in Beggars Banquet, replace that with some piano and strings. Then you also have things like Mick Taylor's beautifully layered lead lines, which convey a certain subtlety to them, which takes centre stage, or Keith starts using wah in some like weird atmospheric ways, like on Coming Down Again, which has some wah, which is put through one of those swirling, rotating Leslie speaker cabinets to a really strange effect. Saying that, it's quite unfortunate that it opens with such an underwhelming song. I mean, the Stones have been having great openers up to this point, things like Sympathy for the Devil and Give Me Shelter, and now we've got Dancing with Mr. D. I mean, you can probably guess by the name if you're not familiar with the song. A song called Dancing with Mr. D is not going to be the most subtle or good of songs. The pace does pick up though with 100 Years Ago. It's got this distinctive and kind of beautiful breakdown in the latter half of the song before then it descends into like a funky clavinet driven loose jam. It's just got some terrific performances all round, and for the most part the funk influence is pretty well incorporated. Do 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 Heartbreaker is a great example. This is one that I originally didn't like. I'm not really a big fan of funk normally, but it just started to grow on me the more I heard it. The chorus is roaring and it just soars so high and free. Jagger seems so notably infused to the direction of the song, with horns blaring away behind his voice and the do-do-do of the background vocals. It's just so damn catchy, and Taylor chucks in a lovely little solo. Much like Sticky Fingers, for me it's the softer moments of the album where it shines the most. The Stones at this point, as I said, have perfected really the art of the ballads, and for a long time Angie was my favourite Stones song. I think that's probably no longer the case, but because of Gimme Shelter, but it is my favourite Stones ballad. It's just about beating out wild horses. It's a tender, heartfelt performance from Jagger over this piano part, and it's a really haunting song about two people who clearly love each other, but for whom the relationship is just doomed to fail. They fight, they have no money, and they're better off living separately despite the love that they share. The second side I feel is a bit weaker, though it does have one of my favourite tracks, Winter, which is a strange title for a track which was recorded in sunny Jamaica, and it's also a song which Mick Taylor co-wrote with Jagger, though of course the Stones being the Stones is credited to Jagger Richards because they just couldn't actually credit someone for writing a song. It's really not great that they do that. The main issue with this album is just its lack of subtlety, if anything. I mean, you got songs like Can You Hear the Music or Star Star aka Starfucker. I mean, wow, Dancing with Mr. D, Starfucker, it's got the subtlety of a hammer to the face, but it is an album that does grow on me more and more with every listen. If you have a soft spot for funk, I'd recommend it more than, I guess, if you don't. But it's not a bad album if you do enjoy the Mick Taylor era, and a little bit of an underrated Stones classic. So I give this 3.5 stars.
How does the production of a Stones album work, Keith? Is it basically really you and Meg?
Well, this time it was, because this is the first one we've done without Jimmy Miller since he did Beggars Banquet was the first one, and he did Up Until Goat's Head Soup. And this one we decided we'd like to have a go again ourselves. The last time was Satanic Majesties, which received mixed reviews.
It's Only Rock and Roll, 1974. This album signalled a significant amount of change in the band, which would forever change their sound. The first change was their producer, Jimmy Miller, who'd been their producer since Beggars Banquet, was let go due to his increasing drug dependency. And it has to be a pretty serious drug dependency to be let go from the Stones. This results in Jagger and Richards giving production a go for the first time since their Satanic Majesties request under the pseudonym the Glimmer Twins. The second big change was this was the final record made with Mick Taylor. Taylor was increasingly growing frustrated at not being credited for songs he co-wrote, which, fair play to Mick, and also the drug culture of the band generally, so he announced his departure. So he only appears on 7 of the 10 tracks on this album, with future replacement Ronnie Wood of The Faces appearing on the title track. In many ways, this album reminds me of AC/DC's For Those About to Rock. Now, bear with me a second. You see, the context of that is that AC/DC had just released Back in Black in 1980, and it was fantastic. But then, a year later, 1981, they made For Those About to Rock, which is a fairly bog-standard album, albeit it has a few brilliant tracks. But overall, it's just not that memorable. It signalled their shift from being a young, dangerous, exciting rock band into being elder statesmen of rock who'd preside on the basis of their legendary status, not really on the music they produce. And this is what would happen to the Stones in 1974. So, for the moments of brilliance, we get Time Waits for No One, a song which Mick Taylor really should have been credited for. It is his contribution which makes this song what it is, his nearly 2-minute solo at the end, and it's just such a musically fluid composition. All the lead lines are sublime as they counterpoint Jagger and Richard's harmony on the chorus of this slow-paced ballad. This is such an underrated Stones song. It is essential listening, and if you have not heard Time Waits for No One, you really got to get on that. And the other flash of brilliance on this album is this title track. It's only rock and roll, but I like it. This sounds like it's straight from Exile on Main Street, a T-Rex style kind of groove all the way through, and it's just such an open song on an album which often feels kind of quite tight and forced. There's just so much room here for the musicians to breathe and just play, for Jagger to do his thing and put his trademark bluesy vocals there and a big gang chorus in the middle, and it's a Stones mainstay on their sets for a reason. It's an absolute classic. But yet again, it's side 2 where this album really starts to, I guess, show its age. It pulls it down from being an enjoyable yet rather unexciting Stones album, albeit aside from the 2 moments of brilliance we've discussed, and then we get appalling stuff like the reggae-inspired Luxury, in which Jagger does a Jamaican accent which is laughable at best and racist at worst. It's one of those songs where listening to it feels a bit like seeing a clip from an old 70s British TV show like The Black and White Minstrel Show and just thinking, why? How did anyone ever think this was a good idea? But it's the final track, the 6-minute 30 epic Fingerprint File, which just destroys all my goodwill towards this side of the album. It is obnoxiously terrible in just almost every respect. It's a song, though, which I guess would come to characterize where the Stones would begin to go next. This is Jagger's attempt to write a dance song and incorporate funk, and this is funky. This is a really funky song. I mean, the funk was kind of subtle and cool in Goat's Head Soup, but here it's just brash and in your face in Fingerprint File, and it just sounds horribly dated. It's aged about as well as Rotting Flesh. This is just such a transitional album. It's a band in turmoil, losing their lead guitarist. As a result, it's a rather subpar album, but it does contain those flashes of brilliance. It's a 2.5 stars.
The trouble with the French is, though, the trouble with the French, if I may take my glass off at this point.
The meat market, the only place you can get off in
The account executive.
Black and Blue, 1976. By 1976, Taylor was gone, and the Stones needed a new guitarist, so they auditioned a bunch, including Ronnie Wood, who would go on to become their permanent replacement, spoiler alert, Rain Perkins as well, and Harvey Mandel of Canned Heat. So as you can guess, here they were kind of having an identity crisis. They really did not know what they were. Were they a rock band? Were they a funk band? Were they a reggae band? Disco band? So they decided, yes, let's just be all of them. it didn't work. The most interesting aspect of this album is its focus on groove and jam-oriented songs rather than, I guess, song-driven or more pop-driven songs, rock-driven songs. And while many critics see this to have been a bold, experimental move for the Stones, in my view, it's just a failure. They try and fuse their sound with like a hodgepodge of every genre that was cool. Yeah, let's add a bit of funk, a bit of reggae, a pinch of disco, and it just destroys any cohesion they could possibly have achieved. Listen to Cherry O Baby and think, yeah, this is wonderful Stones here. This is really classic stuff. Their staccato riff take on the song is awful. It lacks the fluidity that characterises the original Eric Donaldson version, which is not a bad song. Or even the UB40 version is better. Then you've got Hey Negrita, which is a Latin American term meaning little black gal. I mean, do you really think a song called Hey Negrita is going to be good? I mean, I'm worried this video might just get taken down for even mentioning that song. The ballads, I guess, are kind of a momentary safe haven from the trash on this album. Got stuff like Memory Motel and For to Cry, with the former just being far too long. I mean, 7 minutes, and it really did not need to be 7 minutes, though. It's a perfectly pleasant, downbeat ballad with some shared vocals from Mick and Keith. The only song I really enjoy here is Hand of Fate, which is a more traditional, Stonesy, riff-oriented rocker, and it's not really that special, but it has some pretty killer guitar work from Harvey Mandel. And what I guess is otherwise kind of a dreary, uninspired funk song, but hey, it's got a solo that I enjoy. Yeah, as you can see, I'm struggling to find positives to this album. It's a 1 star. It's just, I do not recommend it. Just do not listen to this album.
Some critics say your new album
stinks.
No, they would say it's a terrific record. I think it's a terrific record.
It stinks. Wait till the next one.
Some of them say your record is sexist and possibly racist. What do you say about that?
The next one's going to be more racist and more sexist, and it's going to be a whole bunch better.
I've been holding on so long, I've been sleeping all alone. Lord, I miss you. I've been hanging on so long, I've been sleeping all alone. Lord, I miss you.
Some Gals, 1978. Again, we have a stylistic shift for the band, but in a less transitional way, I guess a way that would stay for a little bit longer than we had in Black and Blue. Some Gals is the full realisation of Yeager as the dominant creative figure in the band. You see, back in 1977, Keith actually received a year's probation after pleading guilty to possession of heroin in Canada, meaning that he just wasn't involved in writing on this album because he was involved in legal troubles, heroin addiction, whereas Yeager had learned to play guitar. So now the Stones are going to go full Iron Maiden or Cavell Attack with a free guitar lineup. And while many actually see this album as a classic, for me, it's a far more run-of-the-mill record, which, while it certainly improves on Black and Blue and whatever the heck that album was doing, it's got a lot more cohesion stylistically, it's a lot more consistent album. I feel that this still lacks the quality that made the band so good. But the other big thing here is that it's Ronnie Wood's first full album with the band, and I feel he offers not that much. He lacks kind of the sparkle and brilliance of Music Taylor's musicality, and that's not to slag him off. He is a good guitarist. He offers some lovely slides, such as on When the Whip Comes Down. And on Beast of Burden, he really shines as him and Keith kind of interlink, moving between rhythm and lead with each other and weaving between each other, and it creates a lovely, cohesive guitar sound. So, for the good of this album, well, there's straight-up rockers, there's When the Whip Comes Down, there's the up-tempo rock and roll in Lies, which is my personal favourite, there's the Keith song Before They Make Me Run, which has some really enjoyable guitar harmonies to it, and actually quite a strong vocal performance. At least the thing with Some Girls is that it certainly lacks the offensively dreadful songs from Black and Blue. It hasn't got a Cherry O Baby or Hey Negrita, but it is chock-block of soulless, lifeless disco pop. I guess you gotta remember in this climate that disco was popular, punk was popular, and the Stones wanted to adapt to it, and Miss You is an example, I guess, of how they did. It predates David Bowie's Let's Dance. I kind of feel a really similar vibe in the way that Miss You, it's hard to be offended by. It's not a song where you instantly just want to turn it off. It's just blasé pop music, a corporate pop product. It feels like the antithesis of the raucous, raw sounds of the Stones' earlier work. In fact, this whole album just feels so safe, so watered down. We got the unlistenable or misogynistic or maybe racist, at least downright bizarre lyrics of the title track Some Girls, with lyrics such as Black Girls Just Wanna Fuck All Night, which is so cringy. I mean, so cringy. And then worst of all, Shattered. I've never understood how there are people who really seem to like this song, and those people do exist. I've never met one, but apparently they do. How anyone can enjoy Jagger's headache-inducing pseudo-rapping with a guitar drenched in an MXR Phaser 100 to such obnoxious levels, I'm not quite sure. The latter's kind of a problem throughout the record. So you might be surprised to hear me say that it's actually one of the better Stones albums of the late 70s, early 80s. The Stones didn't really set a high bar for themselves, and overall it is a rather inoffensive, watered-down album, and I don't think it's really any better than It's Only Rock and Roll, which I know will infuriate a lot of Stones fans as this is considered a classic, but it just doesn't do it for me. 2.5 stars.
This one's called Emotional Rescue. Where did you come up with that title?
I don't know. Be quiet now, Italian restaurant people. We're sitting next door to the kitchen of an Italian restaurant, actually. Sorry, yeah, where did we get the title? Well, it's rescue, right? As in night on a horse, but it's like mental.
Emotional Rescue, 1980. At the time, Emotional Rescue is actually a really big success. It gave the band their first UK #1 since Goat's Head Soup back in 1973, and Dance Part 1 was even a top 10 single in the US dance charts. But critically, it was seen as a disappointment after Some Girls, and, well, I wouldn't really say it disappointed me. That's more due to my lukewarm feelings about Some Girls than anything else. At times, this is just disco Stones in full force. The opener, Dance Part 1, is a dreadful throwaway disco-inspired tune which has aged so poorly, whereas the title track sounds like the Bee Gees, yet with far more uninspired choruses. And Jagger's voice is just plain irritating across a lot of this record. She's So Cold, he sounds really annoying on that, or the cod reggae of Send It To Me. There is a lot to dislike about this album, but there is something worth talking about with it. I was saying with Some Girls that it was disco and punk which were the prevailing genres of the era, and here the Stones decide to try a bit of punk as well as disco. Well, some say they dabbled in it before Emotional Rescue. I think Emotional Rescue is really the first point in which they really did dabble in it, and their clear attempts at punk are Summer Romance and Where the Boys Go. Summer Romance is kind of a bit like a bargain basement Clash. It tries so hard to be dirty and raucous and raw, but the production is so clean and pop-friendly that it just destroys the impact of it. And Where the Boys Go has mixed thick Cockney accents and some cringy guest vocals at the end, and these songs just feel so safe. Punk needs an element of danger or politicization, and the Stones just don't seem to have grasped that. There's one great song on the album, Down in the Hole, more classically bluesy Stones, lovely harmonica parts, slow, brooding, strong atmosphere, gravitas to mixed vocals, and it's the most underrated song on the album, but the rest is just filler. I can't recommend this. 1.5 stars. It's marginally better than Black and Blue.
Mick, is there any truth to any of the rumors that the Rolling Stones may split sometime next year?
What, personalities or physically?
Tattoo You, 1981, is quite the oddity in the Stones' discography. It's mainly just a collection of studio outtakes from around the 70s. There's stuff from the Goat's Head Soup sessions from the early 70s, stuff from the Some Girls sessions in the late 70s. It was just assembled by producer Chris Kimsey out of bits and bobs he found because Mick and Keith really were not getting on very well, but the label wanted a record out. To give some cohesion, the Stones ended up splitting it into two sides. Side 1 is the rock and roll side, and side 2 is the ballad side. In terms of quality, it also is a record of two halves. Side 1 is far superior to side 2 for me. Side 1 begins with a song so breathtakingly good, you'd be amazed at thinking it's from this era of the Stones. Start Me Up. It's not only their best song of the 80s, but it's just as good as any song from the 60s or 70s. Tight rhythm, killer riff, fantastic Jagger performance. It is everything you want out of a Stones song. God damn, is it catchy. And the rest of this side actually features some rather fun rock songs. There's the loose, almost kind of improvisational vibe and groove of the 6.5 minute long Slave with some saxophone, some keys over it. There's also the fun little TNA, which is just Keith sung track, and I guess it's a little bit of a throwaway, but the riffs are strong enough that, hell, it's a pretty fun song. I find the whole of side 1 to just be a really fun side, aside from Neighbours, that's not great. But side 2, the ballad side, read disco-inspired Mick side, just has some of Mick's most outrageously awful falsettos. I mean, I know I'm having a bit of a go at Mick's voice, and I do love the guy's voice in the 70s and 60s, but well, late 70s, 80s, these falsettos, they do get me down. Stuff like Worried About You and Heaven, and despite the latter, Heaven's a kind of experimental streak, it's just so boring. It's just uninspired dirge after dirge. I mean, there are a couple of songs which I do quite like. Tops has a more engaging performance from Mick in the verse, and despite his kind of disco leanings in the chorus, and you've got Waiting on a Friend, which is perfectly pleasant, and is lifted by a nice sax part towards the end, which kicks in. Overall, this album, I mean, of course it lacks cohesion. It's poured across a period of almost like 10 years, and it's got a rock side and a ballad side, and that kind of thing's been done before. Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction actually did that. You got the more hard rock side on side A and the more ballady side on side B, but it doesn't work here. This feels like a hodgepodge of songs from different eras. Still, I do enjoy side 1 quite a bit, and the songs, Tops and Waiting for a Friend are pretty decent. I like this more than fan favourite Some Girls. It is not the worst you could go with 80s Stones. In fact, I'll go out there, it is the best 80s Stones album. It may not be the most cohesive, it may not always be the most enjoyable, but for 80s Stones, it's got some fun rocks and pleasant ballads. I would say it's about 3 stars.
Is it difficult to keep trying to be ahead, keep trying to have fresh ideas?
I'm not trying to be an innovator all the time. I think it's silly to try and be an innovator. You can be innovative within your own, within your own limits, You can't be totally new all the time.
Undercover 1983. In 1983, Richards and Jagger's infamous 80s feud began, which would cause a great rift in the band, as you'd imagine, and no approach to songwriting, with both of them pulling in completely different directions. Keith wanted to go back to basics, a rock, straightforward, guitar-led approach. Jagger, on the other hand, wanted to keep up in this more varied, experimental approach. So, with Undercover, we have a compromise. We have a balance between traditional rock music and reggae, new wave, and funk. And central to this album is the conflict between its two creative leads. As a result, we get one of the Stones' nastiest, most violent and brutal lyrically records, and ultimately, one of their worst. So let's talk about a couple of prime examples of the Stones' shift, courtesy at least of Jagger. We've got Undercover of the Night and Too Much Blood. Now, Undercover of the Night is quite a rare political song. It tackles some of the issues going on in South America at the time with Nicaraguan rebels, but the music, it's just too new wavy for me. It's also got this dominant, strong, funky bass line to it, and look, I admit I'm not much of a new wave fan. I mean, I listen to some Talking Heads, but it's not really a genre that gets me. And in fact, speaking of Talking Heads, Too Much Blood and, to me, that's also Undercover of the Night, they just sound a bit like discount poor man's Talking Head songs. Electronic drums dominating the beats of weird sounds. It's Eerily familiar, but not half as interesting. And then in Too Much Blood, we have this weird pseudo-rap section, which covers the gamut everything from the movie Friday the 13th to the cannibal Issei Sagawa. I mean, at best, it's forgettable, and you'll be glad that you forget it. I have to admit, though, there is something kind of refreshing about the sheer brutality of the lyrics in a Stone song. But still, despite some of the darker themes going on, like with the Nicaraguan rebels or the cannibal Issei Sagawa, I find there's this weird disconnect between the experimentations in kind of happier, more upbeat dance music and then these dark themes being explored, and the brutality is really minimized by the fact that the song sounds so polished and sterile, so tame and commercial. It's just 80s new wave pop. This is the worst thing the Stones ever released. It's completely disjointed. I thought that Black and Blue had an identity crisis, but this takes it to completely new levels. It is everything you'd find in popular music at the time, and not much more. It just does the Stones a disservice. 1 star. Don't even bother.
At the time I did bits and pieces on it, and I don't really know now what I actually ended up doing. Apparently it's out, and I'd really like to hear it, because I haven't.
What was it called?
I don't know. It wasn't called I Don't Know, but I just don't know.
Dirty Work, 1986. Oh, 1986 was a bit of a year for the Stones. The Richards-Jagger feud hit all new levels as Mick decided to just focus on his solo career, sold the Stones, and left Keith and Ronnie to write most of the material, with Jagger just adding some vocals on top. And relations between Keith and Mick got even worse when Mick refused to even go on tour to support the album. And as if that wasn't enough, Ian Stewart, one of the founding members of the Stones, their long-time pianist and also road manager, died of a sudden heart attack at the age of 47, resulting in the tribute to him at the end of the album, the 45-second instrumental version of Key to the Highway. The result, well, it's an album mired in conflict, breakdown, and big-ass 80s drums. I mean, the main songwriting partnership was falling apart, and it was the 80s, so any wonder you got all of these. And this is an album, I would say, most of the time when you're looking at an album, you're looking at its cover art, you always should think, well, I'm not going to judge a book by its cover. I mean, look at Beach Boys' Pet Sounds. It's a bunch of guys feeding goats, and it doesn't look very good, but it's a wonderful masterpiece that's contained within. But please, please judge this album by its cover. It is a hideous cover. The Stones are in pink suits. You've got Mick in yellow on a green sofa and a blue background. It's just so garish. It's so hideous. And, well, so is the album. You might actually be mistaken from hearing the first 2 songs that it's a pretty decent album, that I'm just a hater and that I'm wrong about this. You shouldn't judge the book by its cover. I mean, One Hit to the Body does have a certain swagger and power to it, making it a quite compelling listen. It's also got some lead work from Jimmy Page, bizarrely enough, and his solos are actually pretty cool in it. You then get Fight, which is another decent up-tempo song, and it feels like this album's going to be brimming with some of the life instead of the sterile production that's mired the past few, but no. Then we get ultra-polished Mick dance rock like Harlem Shuffle, we've got Keith's Cod Reggae Too Rude, and the beyond boring Back to Zero. Honestly, it just feels so dialed in. You can care that Mick's heart is not in it. He clearly does not give a shit about what the quality of the music is. He may as well just be messing about with the microphone in his mouth with his annoying gruff vocals or high-pitched woos at random. There's just no cohesion or flow. It feels like Keith is really trying to salvage things, but Mick is the saboteur, and he's not going to let this be a good record. This album doesn't do it for me. I rate it about the same as Emotional Rescue. It is slightly better than Undercover, but then I really, really hate Undercover. 1.5 stars.
Now looking back at it in retrospect, that it was a necessary break, and that time to the best things you can do with things like that is to see what you can learn, and then when it does come back together, to put what you've learned into a sort of positive.
Steel Wheels, 1989. 3 years doesn't seem much between albums, but for the Stones, it was important. Mick and Keith seem to have largely put their feud behind them. Their chemistry is yet again on show. The ship has been righted. And this album was received in the press as a comeback album. It was a return to roots after their nearly decade-long excursion into funk, disco, and just generally away from guitar-focused music or really decent music. But I'm not sure I agree with the consensus this is a comeback record. I mean, it's better than what we've had before, but it's not a great Stones record. It's just merely a decent one. I guess a decent one was enough. So it's not really a wholehearted recommendation. It's more of a subtle recommendation I give you for this one. If you really want to dig deeper into the band, it's a pleasant, inoffensive rock record. It may sound strange to hear me critiquing them for being too safe after lambasting their experimentation over the last, I don't know, however many records, because this is refreshingly rock focused, though it still retains that Chris Kimsey sheen on it. And to be honest, I found this one quite a difficult one to really get my head around where I stood on it. Sometimes I found myself enjoying this album, other times I really found myself quite cold towards it. But then I realised that it was more about the context in which I listened to it. If I listened to this after Undercover or Dare to Work, then I found this to be a breath of fresh air. Finally, a Stones album I could listen to. But if I just listened to it in isolation, I just found a rather middling Stones record. Nothing particularly special out of context. It's just nothing special. Sure, it does recover a bit from their 80s slump, but, you know, there's a few killer tracks, there's a few obnoxious tracks. It's just one of their least memorable albums. There was one review which I think put it really nicely from the website AllMusic. They said, "It often feels as if they sat down and decided exactly what their audience wanted from a Stones album." And indeed it does. It feels like a calculated attempt to go back to the past, but without the risk and the danger that was involved. It ain't great, it ain't bad, it's a 2.5 stars. It's an improvement to end the 80s, but it's not the leap they needed to take.
I know you got a brand new bass player with you.
It's going very well. It's very enjoyable, really, for all things considered. Yeah, it's fine.
Voodoo Lounge, 1994. It would be 5 years after Steel Wheels until the Stones would return to the studio to make the follow-up Voodoo Lounge. And the biggest change in that time was that this is the first Stones album to not feature bassist Bill Wyman, who departed in 1993 as he decided to retire, and was instead replaced by former Miles Davis sideman Darryl Jones. But what really makes the biggest difference on this record is not actually Bill Wyman's departure, but is instead the hiring of Don Was as a producer. Over the last few albums, the Glimmer twins, Keith and Mick, had been self-producing the records, and well, I don't think it went very well. Instead, they brought in Don Was, who wanted to bring a more retro feel, a more 70s classic Stones sound back into the mix. Now, Yeager wasn't initially the happiest about that because Don was trying to steer him away from African rhythms and disco and hip Peter Gabriel WOMAD stuff that Yeager was into at that time. But I've said it throughout this guide, and I'll say it again, the Stones were at their best when they were playing blues rock, and for that genre, they were one of the best bands there's been. But they weren't super successful in incorporating those more disparate influences, and I think Don Was got that, and I think he was right in steering the Stones in the direction he did, giving that distinct retro feel which just harkens back to early Stones. The first two tracks really typify that retro feel. Love Is Strong and You Got Me Rockin'. It'd be easy to mistake Voodoo Lounge as one of the most underrated albums, a 90s classic. These are just full-on rock and roll songs, and they really do hit hard. So for once, let's just start about talking about everything that does work well on this album. We've got Moon Is Up, which is a power ballad with psych leanings and a kind of a 90s alt-rock production. It just works. It's tender, it's understated, and a real grower of a song. Or then we got Mean Disposition, which is a straight-up rock song with the blues running through its veins, and it contains one of Jagger's best vocal performances in years at this point. Emotional rescue and its disco falsetto. This is not. Now for the mediocre and the bad. God damn, is this album long. It is 61 minutes, and that is about 20 minutes longer than it should have been. It wouldn't be that bad if every song on it was killer, but about 1/3 of the record is ballads, and not particularly memorable ballads, and they really do slow down the tempo. Sweethearts Together, for example, which is a sickly sweet ballad which sounds like restaurant music, or Through and Through, which is sung by Keith and just goes on far too long at 6 minutes, or even say The Worst, which is also sung by Keith, and it's a low-key gypsy ballad that just doesn't go anywhere. They just drag at a slow tempo and really bog down the record. The worst songs, as usual, on here are the Mick super 80s stuff. Luckily Don Was able to turn down the production so it doesn't sound as pristine and poppy and commercial and clean, but stuff like Suck on the Jugular is a dreadful funk song which sounds like a Chili Peppers throwaway, or just boring Sparks Will Fly. As a whole, yeah, the album's fine. It's cohesive. It's more cohesive, I guess, than previous efforts. It's certainly listenable, and apart from Suck on the Jugular, it's listenable all the way through, and to have quite an enjoyable, chill time. But I don't find it anything special. It doesn't have that Stones magic into it. It's just better by comparison, like Steel Wheels was, but a bit more refined. 3 stars.
It's just like Beatlemania, except Keith is much cuter than Paul was.
Bridges to Babylon, 1997. After their return to rootsy retro rock with Voodoo Lounge, you might expect they continue on that trajectory, but the Stones did decide with Bridges to Babylon to mix things up a bit. They got in a roulette wheel's worth of producers and bassists. It seems everyone in LA and their dogs was able to have a spin at either the producer's desk or on the bass. Most notably though was the Dust Brothers, who produced Beck's Odelay and also Paul's Boutique by the Beastie Boys, and were kind of masters at sampling in the era. Oh yes, it's a very 90s album we've got in store for us. So let's go through some examples of that pure 90s-ness. I mean, we've got track 2, Anybody Seen My Baby, which is so over the top 90s, it could almost be an R. Kelly song. I mean, it also does have, to my knowledge, the only genuine rap part in a Stones song. No, we're not talking about Too Much Blood, where Jagger kind of pseudo-raps about cannibals and Friday the 13th. No. This is like a genuine guest rapper, and regardless of your opinions on hip-hop or rock music, and certainly the mix of those together, I think we can all agree there's examples where it kind of worked. Maybe Run DMC and with Aerosmith, or Rage Against the Machine, but Rolling Stones, it definitely ain't one of them. We've then got Might As Well Get Juiced, which is by far the strangest song on the record. I mean, to describe it is a challenge. I guess it's one part techno with blaring synth beginning it, and then another part Jagger trying to do his best Muddy Waters impression. So we've got 50s Chicago blues mixed with techno, and shockingly it doesn't work. I mean, props for trying, but Stonesy blues and pulsating rhythms fit about as well as chalk and cheese dipped in hot tar. And that's not to say the contemporary sound fails every time even. On Saint of Me, there are clearly sampled beats, and it does give it a modern feel for 1997, but it's got a great up-tempo chorus accentuated by jabs of the organ and bursts of modern Stones. It just sounds like modern Stones done right, and it's got a cool guitar solo that actually sounds really Slash. But much like 1994's Voodoo Lounge, its main issue is it's just too long, 62 minutes, and not enough quality to justify that running time. I'm sure you're sick of me going on about running time. It's not as if I don't enjoy long albums or long songs. I mean, I'm a prog fan at heart, but this album's just bogged down by so much filler. Or songs that just go on too long, and that's exemplified by the Keith song, How Can I Stop, with its rather ironic title, because Keith, who sung this, clearly could not stop. It goes on about 6 minutes 53, and that marks my favourite part of the song, when the album just kind of fades away and ends. It's tremendously bloated, it's needlessly long, and its contemporary nature doesn't add all that much to it. I prefer Don Was's more focused retro sound to this for a band such as the Stones, and I think it played more to their strengths on Voodoo Lounge. So this one, 2.5 stars. I'm not sure I'd really recommend it highly.
Yeah. Oh, Carolyn, go and pump Mick up. Go on.
I'm pumping him up.
Fluffing about.
Just
I know, because that's me, you know, and you worry about me.
Good for you.
A Bigger Bang, 2005. Now we come to the Stones' final album of original compositions. After Bridges of Babylon's kind of more uneven production, I think they decided, let's try Voodoo Lounge 2.0. Let's go back to basics. And most of the songs were just recorded by Richards, Yeager, and Watts, all together as a free piece, with overdubs added later on by Ronnie Wood and Darryl Jones, etc. Though Ronnie Wood was actually absent for a lot of the sessions, and he only participates on 10 of the 16 tracks here. And if you're sick of hearing me slag off the Stones, you're probably going to be pretty happy to hear that I think this was a pretty good album. Might surprise you after all the shade I've chucked at the band, but this ain't bad. I mean, don't expect the lofty ambitions of this is a return to 70s Stones, no, but is it a sonically consistent slab of Stonesy goodness? Yeah, sure. Rough Justice is the opener and the best track on the album. It punches you in the gut and shows that the Stones could really still write a fun, catchy rock tune with a cool riff to it. But the best moments are just the straight up rock numbers. Let Me Down real slow, or It Won't Take Long, while then you get some breathing space from other stuff like Back of My Hand with its 50s chess record, Muddy Waters production. The issue yet again is just there's far too much filler. I swear you could cut about 5 tracks out of this and then it would be so good, so good. But here it doesn't really let the record down too much. I guess sometimes it just frustrates me that in this period or these 20 years of the Stones, there just didn't seem to be anyone around to really filter out the songs. But then I guess for a band who's been embarking on a tour called No Filter, that's hardly a surprise. So what else is there? Is it all just stripped back rock music? Well, no, there's some funky stuff, as you come to expect from the Stones at this point. Rain Fall Down and Laugh I Nearly Died, and they sound a lot more like they would have belonged on Some Girls, which does feel a little bit dissonant on an album that's largely back to roots rock, but it still doesn't detract too much. But yes, I can recommend this album. This is the best thing they did since Goat's Head Soup, to be quite honest. If you skip straight from Goat's Head Soup to this one, I wouldn't blame you. They're about on par. This is a 3.5 stars, and hell, this also gets some bonus points. It has a song called Sweet Neocon, where Yeager bashes George Bush and Christian neocons, so, points for that, I guess.
Do you think you got it right when you listen back to it now?
Yeah, mostly. I mean, I've never met anyone that thinks that they've got it really right. I mean, it is what it is. It's not supposed to be, it's not tremendously thought out.
Stop feeling better. I believe I write them all down. Well, I gotta stop feeling better. I believe I write them all down. Yeah, I'm feeling down from the bottom of the deck.
Blue and Lonesome, 2016. When I first heard that the Stones were going to be doing their first album in 11 years and that it would be a blues covers record, I can't say that I was that excited. I had about as much anticipation for it as I would any covers album, which is not usually much. But then I heard it and I thought, by Jove, they've done it. They've released the best album they've done since Exile on Main Street. There, I said it. Get out your pitchforks. Tell me, no, Some Girls, that was the best. No, with all the sincerity in the world, this is their best album since Exile on Main Street. It moves and grooves through the sounds that they grew up on in the 50s, and it just works. I do admit you've got to be kind of into your Chicago blues to really get this album. If you like Howlin' Wolf, Muddy Waters, the songs of Willie Dixon, then you're going to really find that this could potentially just be your jam. If you want rock, go to 2005's A Bigger Bang. It's there, it's waiting for you, and it says, hey, I'm a rock record. But me, I'm fairly with Blue and Lonesome. I want some blues. I've said throughout this thing that the Stones, what they do best is the blues, and this is all pure blues. I mean, sure, you could criticise it, say, well, the material's familiar to them, it feels it in its playing. Yeah, they recorded it in 3 days, sure. These aren't tough songs to play on a technical level, they're not. And the choices aren't super obscure. I mean, there's a range of obscurity, but what this album lacks in originality just oozes in feeling. Jagger is on fire, whether on the vocals or the harmonica. Keith and Ronnie locked together in a way that I've never had them locked together in a Stones album, quite frankly. It was all basically recorded in one room with minimal overdubs over these 3 days, as I said, and it sounds like it's the Stones messing around, they're jamming, they're having fun with each other, and it turns out that was the missing ingredient. Fun. There's no egos, there's no tensions, it's just 5 great musicians playing great songs, topped off with even Eric Clapton doing a couple of guest appearances on it. It's one of the best blues records of the last few years, or at least one of my favourites. And it just shows the Stones are still brimming with life, even 50 years later. But despite my praise, it's not a 5-star album. I mean, it is a covers album. It doesn't have much originality, and the arrangements are fairly on the nose. They're not that different to the classic arrangements of these songs, but it's one that I find myself coming back to time and time again. It's perfect to relax to on a long, cold night, and it's the Stones doing what the Stones best. It's a 4-star album. If you like the blues, you're gonna love this one if you haven't heard it already. Wow, this took me a long time to put together, so thank you so much for sticking around to however long this ends up being for me talking about the Rolling Stones. I really do appreciate it, and I really hope you've enjoyed. There's a Spotify playlist I've made of all my favourite songs from the Stones discography. There's at least one song from every single one of their albums, even the ones that I didn't really like. So check that in the description below, give it a listen, and just put it on, shuffle, put it on in order. It's in chronological order. Do whatever you want with it. Also press the subscribe button if you're new to this channel, or click that weird bell thingy that is like there or something that everyone always tells you to click, because apparently YouTube doesn't notify you if you don't click the bell. And to anyone who's watched my content for a while and is wondering why after 2 years I'm suddenly back with a new camera, new microphone, new setup, well, I decided it was time to give things a go again, and I really wanted to finish off this Rolling Stones journey. If you're new to my channel, you probably won't know, but I actually started doing this guide a couple of years ago. I did the first 2 parts of it. I got up to, I think, Some Girls, 1978, but I never ended up finishing it. And then I was thinking of just finishing it and coming back, but editing it together, it didn't look very good, to be quite honest, with me using my mobile phone back in 2018 and now me using an actual camera. So I just decided, sod it, I'm going to do it all over again. One big video, my guide to the Rolling Stones, get it over, done, can move on with new projects. But still, I've enjoyed putting this one together. Thanks so much for watching, listening, or whatever, and as always, long live rock and roll.